I found a debit to an interior design company for an amount I would not have recognized as frivolous when I was young. The sum was large enough to justify a bedroom renovation, not a small purchase. And then, more revealing, a series of transfers to a PayPal account under Tiffany's maiden name. I printed a few pages. The printer clicked in the study, a mechanical staccato that felt vigilant. My hands, which had once folded napkins without thinking, trembled over the paper. The tremor was not shame, it was recognition of betrayal. There were errors, clever ones, masked by plausible explanations. Kevin's help had become a habit of other people's expenses funneling through my accounts. Not an accident, a pattern. I called a friend from the neighborhood bank. I asked general questions about disputed charges and identity fraud. Her voice carried practical calm. You can file a dispute, freeze the cards, you might want to consider a credit freeze. She did not say the words I was ready to hear. She didn't need to. I made the appointments. The world, that same indifferent metronome that had ticked during dinner, now produced procedures and forms. For the first time in years, there was a place to put the messy details. I hired a private detective the next week. It felt excessive, and yet I had reached the point where nothing less made me feel safe. The detective was a woman named Lila who had a lowered voice, sharp eyes, and a manner that made you hand over whatever you had without the conversation getting sentimental. She brought me a file after 3 days with margins of evidence I would not have been able to compile alone. Phone records, timestamps showing calls from my number to merchants I had never called, forged signatures that, once pointed out, looked like their ink had been hurried. She had access to his LinkedIn, his accounts, Lila said when she handed me the packet. Someone with proximity to Kevin, someone who could coordinate the details without leaving fingerprints on the surface obvious to a casual glance. I knew, even before she named her, who the proximity worked for. Financial exploitation is rarely violent in the physical sense. It's quieter, like a slow leak that empties everything without anyone noticing until the sink is dry. It smells different, too. It smells of receipts, of matching handwriting, of a particular brand of entitlement. Kevin was defensive. When I confronted him, he folded in at the edges, the way he used to when he didn't want to upset a client in his marketing department. "I didn't know," he said. "She managed some of the bills for a while. I didn't go through everything." His eyes avoided mine. There was shame there, but not the kind that acts. He had been complicit by omission. "What does that mean, Kevin?" I asked. "You mean you signed for things you didn't verify?" He swallowed. "Mom, it's complicated." "We thought," he stopped, and the word thought in his mouth had the weight of a child who had been found with a broken vase. "You thought it was okay to take from my accounts without asking?" I asked. It was not righteous anger, nor a theatrical demand. It was a factual question, the kind you put to an accountant. He flinched. Tiffany oscillated between fury and denial. I once would have been moved to tears by her anger. Now I catalogued it for clarity. When she raised her voice, arguing that she had contributed in kind, that someone had to pay, I heard not passion, but the same entitled ledger anyone could count, a belief that because you make people comfortable, you may take what you like. Valeria, her sister, arrived for the holidays in a flurry of practical kindness. She had an accountant's mind and a suitcase full of spreadsheets. She sat with me at the kitchen table and inspected bank statements like they were an archaeological site. "This is not small," she said quietly. "These are loans in practice, Margaret. Did you ever sign off on any of this?" "No," I said. My voice had the surprising steadiness of someone who had finally let the water in the bucket overflow so they could see the leak. "No, I did not." Alejandro, when he arrived, smelled of cigarettes and winter cologne, and at first he tried to smooth things over with offers of money and rebukes for fighting during family time. Marco listened and then, with professional calm, said something that shifted the conversation toward the practical. If there are transactions in your name, you should consider involving an attorney. There are powers of attorney and deeds that can protect property. If someone has been using your name without authorization, that has to be documented. You need a paper trail. The paper trail was what I began to build. Leela put together a timeline. I sat across from her in my kitchen, where the fridge hummed like a minor chord, and we mapped the pattern. It was methodical work, and in that method, I found a strange consolation. It was easier to face numbers than faces. My departure was not dramatic. I packed a duffel bag the way I used to pack for overnight retreats, neatly, deliberately. I took the silver keys from their hook by the back door and placed them in the bowl on the hallway table. I wrapped the good china in the tissue paper it had always been kept in, and then I locked the cabinet and slid the key into my pocket. The click of the lock felt like a heartbeat, steady, sovereign. It felt like setting a boundary with a small, definite motion. That night, I left the house with 2 overnight bags, my purse, and a printed stack of statements in a manila envelope. I went to a hotel with an ocean view 3 blocks from the city. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the sea. I left the TV off. I stood at the window and looked out at the water, which is not a miraculous thing, but is a very practical one. It reminds you that horizons exist, that spaces beyond the current conversation are real. I called Robert, a lawyer Marco recommended, and he was blunt in a way that was almost tender. We can draft a letter of revocation of any powers of attorney. We can place holds on accounts, and if necessary, we can file for temporary restraints. We need you to sign a few documents and to stay elsewhere for now. This is the sensible route. There was a relief in doing sensible things. It is not glamorous to put your legal protections in order, but it is powerful. There is dignity in paperwork when the alternative is psychic erosion. Robert told me what to expect. Kevin's initial denial, Tiffany's attempts to gaslight, perhaps a family meeting with voices raised. Don't go, he said simply. They will come to you with promises or with fury. You stay in the room with us when we present the documentation. The empty pantry I had left behind was a symbolic flourish I had arranged for myself. The fridge at home later had a post-it on the door. Mom, it's okay, we'll keep food. The note was sincere in its way, and I appreciated the attempt. Practical steps matter. I put my own costs on a budget, closed unneeded accounts, and set up fraud alerts. I called the Better Business Bureau and reported the unauthorized accounts opened in my name. Each call felt like closing a window in a house someone else had been walking through without permission. Kevin texted me, "Can we talk? Please come home." His messages moved from short and pleading to long and defensive over a span of days. Sometimes he would call and hang up. The defensiveness was a protective shell he had worn for years, the same habit that had helped him in the corporate world when clients objected. His virtue was inconsistency, which is to say, he was good at explaining away things he did not want to own. The day the family came to the hotel, I remember the sun on the promenade like an indifferent varnish. Tiffany arrived first, with a pot of flowers for the room, as if she were a guest bringing a housewarming gift, rather than the architect of my discomfort. She placed the pot on the hotel coffee table with the flair of someone setting a centerpiece. "You don't have to do this," I told her softly. She fixed me with a look. "I thought you would be grateful to have a break, Mom. You made everything for years. People noticed." "I noticed," I said, "and I notice now that my accounts were used without my permission." Her face moved rapidly between indignation and incredulity. "That's ridiculous, Margaret. I would never." "You withdrew funds," I said. "You used my name." Kevin perched on the arm of a chair, like someone waiting for a curtain to drop. "We need to talk about this privately," he said, "not in public." The truth is, the first time I saw that look on Kevin's face, defensiveness draining into shame, I felt a complex relief. Children grow into their own conscience at odd times. He had a memory of the person he wanted to be and the person he had been. It was messy. Valeria came with spreadsheets and a phone full of correspondence between Tiffany and vendors. Marco brought a few legal-minded friends and an air of practical severity. Alejandro arrived a little later, still trying to make peace with the scene, as if he could paint over it with civility. The group sat on the hotel sofas like an awkward congregation, while Robert explained what we had compiled and what we intended to do. "We will draft a letter outlining the unauthorized use of Mrs. Hargrove's accounts," Robert said. He used my last name with professional distance that made me feel both exposed and cared for. "We will request restitution and a halt to financial access pending our review. We'll prepare transfer documents to ensure property and residency protections are formalized. And, if necessary, we'll move for a temporary restraining order." The words were all practical, legal, and utterly devoid of melodrama. It was exactly what I needed, procedures rather than poetry. When Tiffany rose and tried to insist that this was a misunderstanding, Robert listened and then asked a few measured questions. He did not shout, he did not cajole. He presented evidence, the transfers, the signature comparisons, the chain of merchant payments. When he showed the bank's timeline, Tiffany's face changed. Anger gave way to a kind of stunned calculation. She argued that some transactions were loans, that family operated like that. "We help each other," she said, which is to say she wanted to preserve a moral cover for actions that were unethical. Kevin stood up and left the room. I watched him go because I needed to see the physical distance he created for himself, and because I wanted to know whether leaving was an act of shame or avoidance. He stood on the stairwell landing, hands on the railing, and his shoulders shook. It was not a theatrical collapse. It was someone realizing the weight of complicity. Later, when we convened the family in my kitchen, a meeting that felt like an inquest, Robert read the letter we had prepared. The living room smelled of lemon oil and coffee. I had asked Marco to be present because his withdrawal of verbal support would be meaningful to Tiffany, and Valeria had insisted on every spreadsheet. The clock ticked in the background, steady as a judge's metronome. "I am placing you on notice," Robert said. "Any further use of Mrs. Hargrove's financial instruments without express written permission will be considered fraud. We will seek restitution and reserve the right to pursue civil remedies." Tiffany protested. She tore at the air with her hands, the way someone does when they feel a net tightening. "This is an overreaction. She knows we repaid what we borrowed. We're family." "Repayment without documentation is not the same as authorization," Robert replied. "Mrs. Hargrove did not sign for these accounts or their uses. We have records." Kevin's voice broke when he addressed me. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have checked. I should have—" He could not finish. His apology was not a legal instrument, but it mattered. It mattered more than I expected. He had been the one who could have been my shield and had been a diverting current instead. There was a moment when Tiffany looked small, not hungled exactly, but stripped of the certainty she had carried like armor. Valeria, who had been methodical and austere during the meeting, said something I doubt Tiffany expected. "You have to accept responsibility," she said. "If you don't, we'll proceed legally." We want to resolve this without court, but that requires truth. Alejandro, who had been leaning toward reconciliation, shifted his stance. If what you say is true, he said to Tiffany, you play with people's futures. And for what? To keep up appearances? She had no answer for that. There was a silence that felt like a gap you could step across. The outcome was not a theatrical eviction or a police arrest. It was paperwork, meetings, and the steady, slow application of boundaries that were finally legal as well as emotional. We amended the deed. Marco oversaw a transfer that put certain residency protections in place. Robert presented a residency agreement that clarified who had rights to stay and under what conditions. We removed any powers of attorney that had been improperly granted. Restitution negotiations began. Tiffany was asked to leave the house for a period unless she agreed to a written plan to repay and to step back from financial decisions. Kevin agreed to have independent oversight of family accounts. I did not celebrate with a brass band. The victory was quiet, like the closing of a door you locked and the sound of the key turning. I felt, above all, relief and a tiredness that felt like an old sweater. The house looked smaller when I returned, but it also looked as it had when I first moved in, a place I had chosen, now redefined on terms that included me. The locked china returned to its cabinet, unlocked, but its place felt different. I took a routine that had been mine and made it mine again. I made my own appointments. I bought myself a small coffee maker for the kitchen. I sat down with a book in the mid-afternoon light and allowed myself unhurried tea. The clock on the microwave ticked without judgment. My life resumed, but it was no longer a life that folded and unfolded to other people's schedules without regard. Kevin and I have conversations now that are sometimes clumsy and sometimes honest. He has offered to contribute to restitution and to change how our finances are handled. It is not instantaneous repair. Trust, once misused, grows back like a slow sapling, with care, distance, and proof that roots are stable. Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era care, distance and proof that roots are stable. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Tiffany left the house for a while. The last I spoke with her before she went was over the phone. She said things that were a mixture of regret and entitlement. I have chosen to keep the door closed for the moment. Reconciliation, if it is to happen, must be on terms that do not replicate the old abuses. People ask why I left that night rather than waiting until everything was sorted. The answer is simple. Leaving held a power that staying never did. Staying would have allowed the same pattern to continue by a different route, more subtle, less visible. Leaving demanded a response. In practical terms, my absence forced the problem into daylight. It was a deliberate step of boundary setting that exposed the misuse of trust. There are a lot of small victories in the aftermath. Lila, the detective, returned with a detailed timeline that allowed us to approach the bank and recover some funds. The bank cooperated once presented with evidence. Robert facilitated the necessary documents that protected my property. My relatives, who had once offered platitudes, now offered practical help. Valeria arranged a payment schedule, and Marco's connections helped in dealing with the title office. I will not pretend the emotional wounds healed overnight. There were nights when the house felt too big and memories crowded like unwelcome guests. There were moments when I caught myself measuring my worth in how well I could host. Old habits take their time to die. But there was also the recognition of a different kind of living, one where I was allowed to refuse without being punished for it, to say no and to have that no be respected, to lock a cabinet and for that lock to be understood as a boundary rather than a slight. It is a modest dignity, but it is a dignity that tastes like reclaimed tea, simple, warm, and wholly mine. Christmas now has a different shape. We still gather, cautiously and with agreements in place. Kevin sits down for dinner and helps without needing direction. The lasagna is something we make together. Sometimes we argue over who gets which slice. Sometimes we remember the way the lights blinked that awful year and make jokes about it. Thin attempts at knitting the wound into something bearable. I let those jokes exist. Humor is a way of resuming life. If you are listening and you feel the press of entitlement in your own home, if you recognize the click of heels not as fashion but as intrusion, know that taking a step like mine is not dramatic for drama's sake. It is a strategically placed motion that can force accountability. Keep records, talk to professionals. Do not let embarrassment stop you from acting. The world has mechanisms built into it for recovery. They are not perfect, but they are there for a reason. There is one image I return to often when thinking about that Christmas. The ocean from my hotel window. The water was not miraculous. It did not erase what had happened. It was an ordinary kindness, unadorned, that cost her a minimal amount of embarrassment. That day felt like an unremarkable miracle. There were setbacks, of course. Invitations collapsed without reason. A call came late one night from someone who had once been a fixture at my house, sobbing that I had rejected family. I stayed on the line until the conversation ended, but I did not allow the call to plunge me back into caretaking. I acknowledged the hurt, set a time to talk if they wanted to repair, and then closed the line. The skill was in staying compassionate while not being complicit. Work resumed its old cadence. I had been fortunate that my job accepted the practical explanations necessary for the legal meetings and the hotel nights. There is a strange generosity in places where professionalism meets personal crisis. People will step in when a task must be done, and they do not always demand the spectacle of suffering in exchange. I returned to projects with a narrower attention span, but a more focused sense of priority. The urgency of being liked slipped away, and in its place came a steadier urgency to do the work, to do it well, and to leave space for my life outside of it. There were rituals I reinstated with new rules. Tea, for instance, became something I rationed. Certain afternoons were sacred. No visitors, no calls, time to read a book. I put a small brass bell by the front door. Friends laugh at its excessive charm, but the bell signals a choice. If someone rang it during tea time, I would answer, only if I wanted to. Otherwise, I would allow it to go unanswered and accept that an unanswered bell was also a statement. Financial recovery never felt glamorous. The returned funds were a relief, not a cure. Paying off debts, renegotiating accounts, and setting up automatic protections took months of meticulous, mildly tedious work. But those measures made the future feel steady. The manila envelope of bank statements became a talisman of sorts, not because of the paper itself, but because of what it represented, a record that I had kept for myself. Forgiveness entered the picture not as an event, but as a series of choices.
I forgave in small, repeated acts when they felt appropriate, not because others demanded it, but because I wanted to release the emotional weight. Sometimes I forgave and we did not reconcile. Other times, forgiveness was the beginning of rebuilding. I learned to name both outcomes as acceptable. The first major test of the new order came unexpectedly at a summer gathering. I had invited a handful of people, those who had shown respect for the new rules and those I wanted to give another chance. We ate under a patchwork of lights in the backyard, the air heavy with rosemary and the slow, contented hum of conversation. Midway through dessert, someone reached past me for the silver, and in the casualness of that motion, I felt the old pattern nudge.
For a moment, a reflexive apology rose in my throat, the old hostess reflex to smooth and enable. Instead, I placed a palm on the edge of the table and said, quietly but firmly, "Would you like the salad tongs? They're in the cabinet to the left." The hand paused, the person looked at me, and then they smiled and took the tongs from the offered place. No one argued. The moment passed like a current redirected. That night, later, Kevin and I cleared the table together. We moved at the embodied pace of two people who had practiced being ordinary companions rather than co-conspirators in my erasure. There was a soft satisfaction, not triumphant, but real, like having finished a draft on which you have sweated, but which nonetheless finally reads true. I still wake to the sound of the microwave clock clicking, and I sometimes set the good silver on the tray just to see how it catches the light. Those small gestures are not proof that everything is fixed. They are, instead, a record of a life being remade brick by careful brick. If you are in the middle of a similar undoing, if you are learning to protect what is yours, remember that dignity is not always loud. Often it is a list, a lawyer's number someone recommended, the name of a therapist, a friend who will bring a casserole without a lecture. It is the competence to make a phone call and the willingness to refuse a request that tastes bad to you. It is the habit of sleeping in a hotel when the house becomes too loud with obligations. It is, in the end, the ordinary, stubborn work of living on your own terms. On the anniversary of that winter night, I found myself once again at the hotel by the sea. The ocean looked the same, distant, steady, indifferent in the best possible way. I watched the horizon while sipping tea from a cheap ceramic cup. Not everything had healed, and perhaps some things would never settle into the neat lines we wished for. But I had learned to hold a map of my borders and to honor them. The ocean offered a kind of permission to keep moving, to accept the possibility of gentleness, to know that leaving sometimes returns you to yourself. When I closed the room door and walked back toward the city, the key in my hand felt ordinary and light. It was not a weapon or a trophy. It was, simply, a thing I kept for myself. The house waited with its locked cabinets and steady light switches, a place that belonged to someone who had learned to say no and to stand by it. Outside, the evening traffic moved along its small, indifferent currents, and I understood that life would continue to be made of such small acts: the locking of a cabinet, the exchange of a polite text, the arrangement of a single dinner, arranged now, finally, in a sequence that honored me. Spring moved through the city in a thin, determined way. Pollen on the windshield, a sudden brightness that made the apartment's pale walls look almost audacious. My therapist,
Someone whose office smelled faintly of lemon and who had a tendency to tilt her head when I said something significant, asked once, in the middle of a session, "What would you do with a day that belonged only to you?" I thought about it and surprised us both by answering without the old reflex to plan for someone else's needs first. "I would buy a cheap umbrella and walk to the pier," I said. "I would buy nothing there. I would sit and watch people not belong to me." The therapist made a small note, and then, when I left the writing-heavy room, I went to the pier and sat beneath a sky that had steel in it. I bought nothing. I watched a man teach his child how to skip stones and felt a steadiness settle in my chest like a well-set stone. It was not joy in the melodramatic sense. It was the less glamorous sensation of being allowed to simply be intact. Work supplied its own steady timetable of responsibilities and tiny satisfactions. Emails answered. A project landed that required me to speak fierce, competent words in meetings. A colleague who complimented my research with an honesty that felt rare. In those professional moments, I noticed, with a certain amazement, that my voice did not shrink. People listened. I still flinched sometimes. Old reflexes are stubborn. But then I corrected my posture and kept speaking. Authority had a taste now that was not bitter, still unfamiliar, but mine. There were ruptures, too, not movie-style dramatic confrontations, but days when an old pattern slipped through the seams. Once, a mutual acquaintance, someone who had known me only peripherally through the messy years, asked for a favor that would have required me to explain too much. "You always set things right," she said, as if that were a virtue I had been allowed to carry. I felt the tug of the hostess reflex, the desire to smooth, to make the world easier for others by positioning myself as the fixer. For a moment, I almost said yes. Then I pictured the manila envelope of bank statements, the list of numbers and names that had taught me to honor my margin, and I felt the word no form in my mouth like a small, clear bell. "I'm not the right person to take that on," I said. It was softer than I expected. The woman paused, then laughed as if relieved to be excused of some burden. I realized afterward that I had not been trying to punish anyone. I had been practicing the simple economics of care. My resources, emotional, temporal, were not unlimited. Saying no was a way of keeping some for myself. Kevin and I fought about as much as a couple who had learned to navigate each other's idiosyncrasies fights, over dishes left in the sink, over the proper angle for a throw pillow. The fights were not emergencies. They were small adjustment pains around the architecture of sharing. Once, during a disagreement about whether we should invite his brother for a long weekend, I felt old anxieties creep in, an almost animal knowledge that if I displeased him, it might be costly. I named it out loud. "I'm noticing I'm afraid of being a problem." He stopped and looked at me with a patience that was not pity. "Then tell me what's a problem and what's not," he said. We talked. We drew a loose map of acceptable behavior and a list of non-negotiables. It was ridiculous and useful, like putting a leash on a wild idea so it wouldn't bite. We did not perfectly abide by it. We lived with the kind of human imprecision that does not erase commitment. There were legal threads, too, tidy and dull. A refiled form, a signature, a notary stamp. Each one afforded a small sense of closure, not because they erased what had been done, but because they established accountability in the world outside private memory. A final tax form was accepted, an old joint account closed. The world responded to paperwork in a way that felt almost consoling. There is a strange theology in bureaucracy. It often affirms existence. Spring moved toward a thin, hot June. We had friends over for dinner. No patchwork of lights this time, only the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle clink of plates. People arrived with their complicated lives in tow. A new job, a baby, a breakup. Conversation folded and refolded like linen. At one point, when things threatened to drift toward the old dynamics of everyone appeasing and smoothing, I found myself speaking up, not loudly, but with a clarity that surprised me. "I'd prefer if we each brought our own containers for leftovers," I said. It was not that I was precious about Tupperware, but the request was a way of practicing a larger habit, not to take on without asking consent. A friend nodded and laughed. Another made an adjustment and offered to do the dishes. Kevin caught my eye across the table and raised his glass. For a second, we shared a look that contained all the small triumphs that no one else could quite see. Negotiated boundaries, a saved scar tissue, the presence of a person who had learned to stand with me rather than for me. After everyone left, we sat on the balcony with peeled grapes and the city's distant rumble. The apartment felt like the hull of a small ship that had weathered a stiff private storm. It did not feel unassailable. It felt like a place from which we could set out again, cautiously, into the world. Before bed, I went through my routine, locking cabinets that stored not only utensils, but the story of what I had chosen to keep. I set the good silver on its tray out of habit, and then, for the first time in a long while, I did not examine it for signs of use as a measure of my worth. It simply gleamed and then became part of the background of a life arranged on my terms. I slid the key into the bowl by the door and turned off the hallway lamp. The apartment breathed in the dark.
Kevin's foot brushed mine under the blanket on the sofa. It was an ordinary contact, and therefore, to my new ears, a declaration. I lay back and let my thoughts unfurl without needing to tidy them. Outside, somewhere in the city, someone else was making an argument, or an apology, or a list to be filed in a shoebox. Inside, a small house of agreements held, not as a fortress, but as a steady, living structure. I did not know what would come next. Old people sometimes reappear. Opportunities present themselves disguised as tests. But I knew how to answer a few of them now. I knew I could say no. I knew how to call a lawyer if necessary, how to choose a therapist and pay her without flinching, how to host dinner in a manner that honored me. Sleep came eventually, ordinary and enough. In the morning, the light would find the rosemary and the shelf and the receipts in the shoebox. I would make coffee and fold the napkins and, at some point, perhaps pick up the book I had not yet read and begin again at a pace that felt right for me. The world would keep its pressing demands. I would keep my list of small refusals and small treasures. For now, that would be enough.